Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank you for the invitation and for the opportunity for me to share this research, particularly the methodological implications of this study. The study concerns third country nationals whose children are being denied access to state education. As we shall see, various complications arose and these impact arose as I was trying to collect data, recruit participants, and these impacted both the data collection process and then the results as well. And for the purpose of this presentation, when I mention migrants, after presenting the context, I will be referring to third country nationals. So I'll avoid saying third country nationals all the time. So I'll be referring to them. So let me give you an idea of the context. There has been a radical change in the demographic landscape of the island. I don't know whether you are familiar with the island of Malta. For a long time, it was a monocultural, monoethnic island. However, since the turn of the millennium, this landscape started evolving. First by people arriving to seek asylum, and later by the arrival of migrant workers. For instance, once the derogation regarding migrant labor was lifted, workers from within the EU increased. Now, due to an ever-growing and expanded economy, more migrants were needed, excuse me, to work. And these third country nationals started being imported, with the word imported being an operative word. So they were imported by agencies to work in sectors such as construction, elderly care, and hospitality, amongst many others. So many of these migrants earn the minimum wage or something near the minimum wage, a little bit more. And the minimum wage is less than 1,000 euro. And from that, they have to pay the rent and bills and so on. So the majority of these migrants, these third country nationals, work in low-earning jobs. And they are often exploited due to their stay on the island being linked to the work permit. So if their employer decides to withdraw their work permit, they have to either find a job within 10 days or otherwise they have to leave the island. Many of them have paid a lot of money to come, and so they cannot really afford to leave their place of work. That's why the exploitation. Sadly, the political discourse from politicians of all hues marginalizes these persons, and they use migrants as scapegoats, blaming them for their own lack of foresight and planning. All right, we have hospitals which are overcrowded, class teachers who have not been prepared to deal with migrant students, and many other infrastructural challenges. And they are often positioned within utilitarian narratives. They are simply regarded as tools that are necessary for the economy to function, for the economic machine to function. Other than that, they are either invisible in political discourse or maligned, whatever suits the politicians. So, third country nationals, while family reunification is possible, it is only possible after 1 year. So, third country nationals have to be in Malta and working for 1 year before they are able to apply for family reunification. And they must earn nearly 19,000 euro, which is not a small sum, plus an additional 20% for each dependent. So if they have 2 kids and a wife, they have to earn 20% for each of them. And migrants know about this. Since this is written on the Identita website. Identita is the agency which gives them the identity card, all right, and the permits to stay here. However, while they know about this amount that they need to earn, they are not aware that Identita will not register their children to give them an ID card. And without the ID card, they cannot access education, state education. And this is not written anywhere in the policies of the Directorate for Education. So they wouldn't know this until they go and register their children. So the sociology of absences was chosen as a theoretical framework since the migrants in the study feature centrally to this theory. Their rights have been devalued and rendered invisible by the education system, invisible because they're not even allowed to be present at schools. They face structural inequalities, such as legal precarity, due to the way the laws are written, which are definitely not in their favor, but also due to lawyers' fees being prohibitive and lawyers taking advantage of their situation. And these issues are often regarded as lacks or deficits in the migrants, rather than power structures which discriminate against them. So this is an exploratory study. As far as I am aware, there has not been any other study which is being conducted or which has been published at least about this situation of migrants and migrant children. There was just a newspaper article after we started this whole process. Even I myself did not know anything about this. I was not aware of this situation until I saw a post on a Facebook page where a parent was asking, why isn't my child being allowed to attend school? And I told her, no, it's against the law, it's against the UNHCR, United Nations Children's Charter. Charter of Rights, and she kept insisting that no, it is not possible. And I put her in contact with the law clinic. The law clinic is at the University of Malta, where students who are law students at their last year practice law pro bono with the guidance of established lawyers, and who happen to be lecturers as well. So they practice law pro bono, and I referred them to this law clinic. I have to go back. So I wanted to know who are these parents, because at first I thought there might be a particular pattern, a particular cohort of parents who are targeted. Are there any pattern manifested in the experiences of parents as they traverse the bureaucratic landscape of Identita? How do parents negotiate with Maltese authorities? And there was quite an interesting finding about this. And what implications does the unwritten policy of exclusion have on their children's educational trajectory, on their well-being, on the children's and the parents, as well as the parents' employment-related issues? Since if the children are not at work, what are the parents going to do? Both parents cannot work if the children are not at school, and they cannot earn that amount of money to be able to apply for their child's residence. So it's like a vicious circle. I adopted an interpretivist paradigm and employed a phenomenological approach to explore these participant subjective experiences, and because not every participant in this study experienced and understood and related to what was happening to them in the same way. So I wanted to understand that these migrants experiences without seeking to generalize. Without seeking to generalize. So, the sampling strategy. As I said, I had referred many of these parents to the law clinic, and I felt that recruiting participants from the law clinic would be wise. The lawyers there working there would be the gatekeeper, so the participants would be ensured that they are safe. However, this did not work out. None of the people who were approached by the law clinic came back to me. So I put a blurb on Facebook on the same page where these parents had written, and I got about 3 or 4 responses. But when I sent back the information letter, I sent back the consent form, I sent back the questions so that I wanted to make sure that they felt safe, they knew what they were going into. I did not get back any of these persons, and they did not get back to me. So I had to find another way. So one of the parents whom I sent to the law clinic kept in contact with me. And I again sent her the information letter, and I told her, listen, if you know someone who can participate, kindly ask them if they wish to do so. And this how the snowball sampling came into it. What happened as well, I was speaking with 2 of my colleagues who said, listen, my barber's brother is in this situation. Perhaps he would be interested to speak to you. And I got 2 participants in this way. Obviously, there are some limitations because most of the participants, so I had 1 Moroccan, one Turkish, and the others were Colombian. Right? So they were all from the same group. And I would have liked to see the experiences, to learn about the experience of others who are outside the Colombian group were quite tight-knit. So I wanted other people's experiences. So, but that was another limitation I had to live by, basically. Data collection, I collected data through semi-structured interviews because I thought that was the most obvious. I wanted to hear their stories. I wanted to hear what they were going through, how they negotiated all these issues with education, with identity. So I thought I felt semi-structured interviews would be the best way, and it's true. For me, they were the best. I couldn't do a questionnaire, for instance, because I didn't know to whom to send it. So in semi-structured interviews were the best thing to do. However, there was a language barrier. 3 of the participants knew how to communicate in English, but English was not their first language. And they were not as fluent, so they knew how to express themselves, of course, but then when it came to very intimate expressions or very emotional expressions, they found themselves at a loss on how to express themselves in English. So, and sometimes even our conversation, sometimes they would not understand the question. So I have to restructure it. I have to use different words. I have to use simpler words. And I felt that going through this all the time impacted also the conversation, halted the conversation. It's different when your conversation is flowing than when you have to stop, think what words to use, think about making things simpler. For the others, I had to engage an interpreter. Now, since the parents were vulnerable not because they were here without documentation or they were here irregularly, but vulnerable because of their children. All right, they were going to expose that their children were not here in a regular manner. I had to find an interpreter whom I trusted. Now, don't think I know many people who are interpreters, but as it happens, I was speaking with a colleague and he said there is this interpreter of Spanish who works within the migrant community. He's very sensitive to these issues, and so I engaged him. Again, when you hear the person speaking, you can understand perhaps the nuanced language that the person is using. You can elicit from what the person is saying from the nonverbals and you know, but when they're speaking a language you don't understand, I mean, you might understand that they're angry or they're sad, but you wouldn't know for what reason unless there's the interpretation. And since the interpretation came afterwards, some of this data then got lost. Also because the interpreter did not interpret word for word. All right, he let the parents speak, and then he paraphrased. So, you know, when you're listening to an interview, it's one thing. When you're listening to a paraphrasing of this interview, the data collected, I mean, I'm sure he was honest in what he was relaying back, but some of the information, some of the data would still be lost. Another limitation was this was also a trust issue, I felt. And first of all, some of the participants who then were not participants because they would not turn up for the interview. They did not turn up for the interview. And I'm sure because they did not do so because they were scared that we might report them to the authorities, something which we ensured them that we're not going to do. But some of them did not. Others, I offered my office as a place where the interviews can be held. It's quiet, and there aren't many people around. But most of them chose to be interviewed elsewhere. And sadly, they chose places which were not very quiet. They chose cafeterias. And you know, sometimes they have background music. There's the noise of cups and saucers and machines and people talking. And so there, I also lost some of the data because while we were talking, it was I could understand them, but the recording, the music and the sounds, the others background noise interfered with the recording, and so some of the data was lost there as well. The analysis was thematic, and some of the themes were bureaucracy, which was it seemed to be a terrible and interminable, and it stalled the process all the time. for them to produce the documentation. There was racism, and those who had the support of a Maltese person found it easier to navigate the bureaucratic processes. Schooling, for example, there were parents who said there are heads of school who would accept our children without documentation. But you know, if you're in primary and next year you're going to secondary, the head of school there might not accept you without documentation. So their schooling would still, they would still not be able to go to school next year. So other parents resorted to online tuition. They resorted to private tuition, which was costing them a lot as well. Some had concerns because their children were already teenagers. They had been out of school for 2 years, and they were concerned that what are they going to do? Staying all day by themselves, they might get into trouble. So there were these worries as well. And then there were the concerns. Should I stay here? Should we go? And it depended on what parents came for. If they came for safety, because Malta is safe compared to their country of origin, they would prefer to stay. Others who came for because of employment were thinking about going, and others had already bought their tickets to leave the island. That's all I have to say. Thank you for listening. I don't know whether I have any other questions now.
Thank you, dear Louise, for your very interesting presentation. Once again, I'd like to inform the participants that they can ask questions, but however, they will be recorded if they choose to do these questions by raising their hand, meaning that this session is registered and also shared on YouTube. So, dear participants, you have the opportunity to make questions on the presentation, either by writing on the chat box or by raising your hand. And as I mentioned in the beginning of this session, by raising your hand, you're giving your consent of being recorded. So now let's wait for questions. Louise, I find your presentation very interesting, but I'd like to ask you about an opinion. Do you think this strategy or these requirements on schooling their children might be somehow a deterrent strategy from the government of Malta, meaning that they intend to discourage people from migrating or living longer in Malta?
I think it definitely is. Education policies say nothing about it, so parents would know when they go to register their child. So by then it would be too late, the children are here. It goes against Malta as a signatory of the Charter for Children's Rights, the United Nations Charter for Children's Rights. So it goes against that charter. It also goes against the law, basically, because the law says every child has the right to attend school irrespective of status and so on and so forth. So yes, it is a deterrent, but sadly parents wouldn't know about this.
Yeah.
And sometimes parents, what I found, are still determined to stay here.
I understand.
They find that, for instance, it's safer, it will provide their children with more opportunities, even if they are outside of school.
Yeah, I understand. Okay, now we have a question. Evelyn Reuter has a question.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. I have a couple of questions. I would just start with the first one. So you're also a lecturer at the university. So I wonder if you teach your methods or if you reflect on your methods also with your students in your courses?
I don't teach research methods. Actually, when in the study unit of research methods, I teach about the ethics of research, not about the methods. So I don't teach that's your question, whether
Yeah, okay, but then you also reflect on the ethical issues of research, and then I think this is also a very good research that you do to reflect on ethical issues because migrants and also children, especially children, are vulnerable groups, and you have to consider ethical issues more, don't you?
Yes, definitely. That's why for instance, I knew many parents who were facing this issue because of the Facebook page and the discussion. But I didn't want to approach them myself. I didn't want to approach them because I didn't want to put them in a spot. Listen, this person helped me, so so I think I should help her back. Or I didn't want to put them in that spot because I know it's sensitive for them. They were afraid that their children will be sent back. So what are they going to do? So I did. Actually, in my lectures, I do emphasize on the importance of informed consent for the parents first of all, because if they are minors, it's the parents who have to give consent, but also of the child. Even if parents give consent, we shouldn't force the child to participate in a study, for instance. You know. Yes, I think yes, I do. This was a process, I think, that made me question even whether I should even conduct this study, to be honest. Because it's very sensitive even for the parents. And in the end, I decided that this should go. People should know what's happening, and I did want it to go on the newspapers, because what happens on the newspaper, there's a fuss for a day or two, and then it dies out. But academic research there's the support of what the parents are saying, and I think I felt I was obliged. It was an obligation to put this in the public sphere.
Thank you.
If I may ask another question.
Yes, I hope I answered.
Yeah,
I
I just have another question. So, because you said that you had interviews from Turkey, but also from Colombia, so I suggest they have also different religious backgrounds. Could you see any differences, or did religion play a role at all?
No, at the stage, no one mentioned that religion was playing a role. What they mentioned was, for instance, the constant going back and forth. So they tell you, listen, you have to bring these 5 documents. They take the 5 documents and they tell them, no, you have to bring another one. And so they go back home, they get this other document, they go and no, we need another one yet. So most of them, this is what they reported. I don't think it's religious. It's a religious issue, but I think it has to do with racism, perhaps. And as I said, the government wants workers. It doesn't want their families, because families would mean more students in schools, so they would need more classrooms, more teachers, more resources. more people would need the hospital, you know. So they just want the workers. And I think that's the strategy. That's why all this bureaucratic inferno, all right, because it is a hell of bureaucratic. For instance, they need the insurance. One of the parents had a child who had a disability, and no one would insure this child because of this disability. And the child was visually impaired, so it wasn't a disability, you know, which needed hospitalization, for example. He was just visually impaired, and they wouldn't. So these parents struggled until they found a kind person who worked at a particular insurance who said, yes, I will insure you. But this took months, you know, and children are still out of school all these months. Some children have been out of school for 2 years. And now I've known a person, a family whose children have never gone to school, and they're over now, over compulsory school age. So this has been going on for a very long time.
Oh, thank you for your answer, Louise. But as you put the situation in this way, so your government is going to solve the problem in the short time with workers, but do you think it will face long-term social problems with these, let's say, migrants of second generation that are not being educated, are not having as you said, health insurance or social insurance?
It's definitely. All right. Many of them are adamant. I've come here and I'm going to stay here. I have nowhere else to go. I don't want to go back home because of the dangers, for example. So they stay here. Their children are not going to school. Some have been here 11 years, for instance, and these who were here for 11 years, for instance, their parents came as refugees, but the children are not considered refugees, for example, because there are a lot of laws, different laws and different, you know, I personally do not know all these laws, but not everyone is considered a refugee, apparently. And so they won't give documentation to the children. So they've been here, they're over school age now, over compulsory school age, and no one has ever taught them how to read and write, for example. In Maltese and English, how are they going to survive living in a country where, I mean, you will survive, you will not die, but, you know, how will you participate in the public sphere? How will you gain that sense of belonging? And as I see it, there are going to be repercussions in the future. I mean, not only for these children who are out of school, there are children who are in school who are being ignored, migrant children who are being marginalized, migrant children whose identities are totally obliterated from the education system. You know, we're going to have repercussions, but we always look at the short term, I think, short-term benefits.
Thank you for your answer. Maybe we have other questions. Yes, Evelyn would like to ask something.
Yeah, it's not that much a question, but I have a comment on one of your observations from your research. You said that you offered your office as a place for an interview. And I think what you had in mind was that it is a quiet place and you can have a good talk and you have a good quality of your recording. And you also said you lost data because you had to switch to a cafe, which was not your choice because your interviewee's choice. And this happened also to me during my research. And yeah, I'm also a bit yeah, I don't know how to deal with that. But I think that why do they do that? Why do they choose this place? And I think what makes them more comfortable in a public space is that they are seen, and that means it's more or less a safe space, because when they are in your office, for example, then the door is closed. No one sees what you're talking about, what happens. We don't know what experiences they have. And I think also, yeah, it's also a matter of maybe of gender. So when some males are afraid of being in a more or less private space, like an office with a female interviewer, and also for female interviewers, it might be more safe in a public than with someone, because it's not so the situation, so the whole constellation is very asymmetric. Yeah, you're seen as a professor from the university, and a researcher who has more resources to speak with Bourdieu. You have a bigger social capital, yeah, which
Yes,
you
yes.
can use, and they are somehow dependent, and of course they are interested, and maybe they hope to get something, to gain something. But still, safe space, the safe space I see is more in the public.
Yes, that's what I said. I said they felt safer in a public space.
Yeah.
Then it was more convenient for me. My office was more convenient because, as you said, it's quiet. But I'm sure they felt safer and more comfortable in a public space where we are more, I mean, not equal, but we're on a more equal footing, perhaps, since it was a place of their choice.
Yeah.
And regarding gender, most of the participants were women, actually, and some of them came with their husband, for example. So I don't think it was an issue of gender and safety in that way. I think it was more balancing the powers, staying in a place they want to be rather than in a place I suggested. Actually, I told them, listen, I can offer you my office, but if you want to find anywhere else where you are more comfortable, just do so. And they chose and incidentally, one of them invited us to her home as well, invited me to her home.
How was the situation there? Have you been alone with that person, or was there someone else?
Oh, she was a single parent with her daughter, so I felt totally comfortable there, and she was comfortable too. She was cooking and answering my questions, so it was she was one of the most vocal participants, actually. And what's interesting is how she managed to negotiate how to go to Identita with some help now, because she worked in a gym, and the Prime Minister goes to this gym, and she said, I think I might have shown her identity like this. So I think I'd rather stop here.
Okay, thank you for your answer. So do we have other questions?
I want to thank, and I must leave
okay.
you. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
I am in a short-term scientific mission in Sweden, and the colleague is waiting for me.
Thank you for your participation. Thank you. See you
you.
in our next
Yes.
sessions.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
I just wanted to follow up with a comment, because this is this is also something that I wanted to say. So inviting to home is really a sign of feeling comfortable, also to show how they live, because I'm sure they don't have all big houses and maybe they have just small rooms. And with kids, it might be a bit messy. So yeah, maybe they don't also want to show this how, because they feel ashamed. But in this case, I really can understand that. But I experienced it in different situations, that even there have been other persons around, like the wife or a sister or even the father or the son. So just to make sure that no borders are crossed and it is really a safe situation. And for me, it was a bit strange because then sometimes another interlocutor just jumped into the conversation. But yeah, this is something I think we have to deal with.
Yes, I think she